For decades, I thought leaving my children a fortune would be the final proof of my love. But one cold Vermont evening, I told them it was gone. I needed to see who they were without it. The sharp edge in Daniel's voice, the chill in Rebecca's silence, and the quiet strength in Lucas's touch told me more than any will or bank statement ever could. I was standing by the kitchen window that morning, watching a few stubborn maple leaves cling to the branches, while most of the others had already turned to gold and drifted onto the lawn. The air in Ashford, Vermont had that crisp bite that hinted winter was on its way. I could feel it in my knees before I even stepped outside. At 74, my body had begun to tell me truths I used to ignore. The pills in the little plastic organizer on the counter were lined up like a weekly reminder that time was no longer something I could take for granted. I thought about the life I had built piece by piece over decades. Back in 1985, when I signed the papers to open Hayes Freight Lines, I had nothing but a second-hand desk, a used pickup truck, and a stubborn belief that hard work would keep food on the table. I ran dispatch myself, negotiated with clients at their kitchen tables, and drove those trucks when drivers called out sick. By the time I sold the company in 2019, there were offices in 3 states, and a fleet I could hardly count. The day the final wire hit my account, the number was so large it almost looked like a mistake. $102 million. No confetti, no champagne, just me sitting in my office with the blinds half closed, feeling both relieved and strangely empty. I never told my children the real number. They knew we were comfortable. They saw the summer cabin, the nice car in the driveway, the trips we could afford. But I downplayed it, called the cabin a modest investment, said the car was leased. I thought I was protecting them from the poison I had seen in others, when money turned into expectation. I had watched friends lose their families over inheritances, siblings stop speaking because someone got more than they thought they deserved. Lately, though, with the doctor using phrases like long-term maintenance and quality of life, I had started to wonder, if all the money disappeared tomorrow, would my children still come to see me, still sit at this kitchen table, just to talk, still check in without an agenda? Or had I unknowingly raised them to circle only when there was something to be had? That question sat in my chest like a stone. The decision came to me the way Vermont mornings turn cold without warning. I would tell them the money was gone. A bad investment, a trusted partner who let me down, something vague but believable. Then I would wait and see what remained when they thought there was nothing to gain. It wasn't revenge, at least that's what I told myself. It was clarity I was after. I pulled out my old leather-bound planner from the drawer, the one with the worn corners and pages that smelled faintly of cedar. Flipping to an empty page, I wrote in neat block letters, "Dinner with the kids. Saturday, 6 o'clock. Underneath, I made a list of their favorite dishes from when they were little. Daniel had always loved roast chicken with rosemary. Rebecca liked mashed sweet potatoes with extra butter. Lucas never cared much what was on the plate as long as there was warm bread and honey. That afternoon, I drove into town, stopping at the market to pick up what I needed. The woman at the counter commented on how early I was doing my holiday shopping. I just smiled and said it was for a family dinner. The truth felt too heavy to share with anyone else. Back at home, I stood in the dining room looking at the long oak table that had been in the family since before I was born. I ran my hand along its surface, remembering birthday cakes, Thanksgiving turkeys, and quiet weeknight dinners when the only sound was forks against plates. Soon, all 3 of my children would sit here again. It had been months since that happened without a holiday or an occasion to force it. I wondered if they would sense something different in the air. I checked the cabinets, set aside the good china, and polished the silverware my mother had given me. The motions were familiar, almost comforting, but my mind kept drifting to the moment when I would say the words. I could picture Daniel's sharp eyes narrowing, Rebecca's brow furrowing Lucas's steady gaze, waiting for the rest of the story. I rehearsed it in my head, softening the edges so it didn't sound like an accusation. It had to feel like unfortunate news, not a test. By evening, the sky had turned the deep blue of early winter, and the porch light cast a warm glow on the front steps. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of pine from the woods beyond the yard, and thought about the gamble I was about to take. The truth was still mine alone, but soon I would set something in motion that couldn't be undone. I went back inside, closed the door against the chill, and wrote 3 short messages on my phone. Just a simple invitation to dinner this Saturday, nothing more. My finger hovered over the send button for a heartbeat, then I tapped it. The messages went out into the quiet evening, carrying with them the first step of a plan I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to see through. Saturday arrived with a thin veil of frost on the grass, and the kind of stillness that made the whole town feel like it was holding its breath. I spent the morning in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, the scent of rosemary and garlic already filling the house. The roast chicken was in the oven, its skin slowly turning golden, and a pot of sweet potatoes simmered on the stove. Warm bread dough rested under a towel near the window, rising in the sunlight. These were the flavors my children had grown up with, the smells that had once meant comfort and home. By mid-afternoon, I had set the table with the good china, each plate centered on the polished oak silverware catching the light from the chandelier. I poured water into the crystal glasses and laid out a dish of butter just the way Rebecca liked it, soft enough to spread without tearing the bread. Every detail felt like a memory stitched into the present. Daniel arrived first, just as the clock in the hallway chimed 5. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and opened the door to find him in a dark gray suit tie knotted tight, hair smoothed back like he had stepped out of a boardroom. His hug was brief, his cologne sharp and unfamiliar. He glanced around the entryway as if taking stock, his gaze lingering for a moment on the painting above the mantel, before he set his leather briefcase down. Rebecca came 20 minutes later, her phone pressed to her ear as she stepped inside. She wore a tailored coat and heels that clicked against the hardwood. Her free hand waved at me, her eyes scanning the room as she finished her call with a clipped goodbye. She kissed my cheek lightly, then brushed a stray hair from her forehead, already asking if she could leave her bag in the den. Lucas arrived last, just before 6, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, a paper bag from the bakery in his hand. He wrapped me in a hug that lingered, the kind that made me close my eyes for a second. The bag held a still warm loaf of sourdough, and he grinned when he said he thought it might go well with dinner. We sat down together, the clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation filling the room. Daniel asked about the weather in town. Rebecca mentioned a new campaign she was managing at work, and Lucas talked about his students and the fall play they were rehearsing. For a little while, it almost felt like any other dinner, like the years hadn't stretched the space between us. When the plates were nearly empty and the wine glasses half full, I set my fork down. My heart thudded against my ribs, but my voice stayed even. I told them I had lost most of my savings. There had been some bad investments, I said quietly, and a business partner I trusted who left me in a difficult position. What was left would be enough for me to get by, but there would be nothing to pass on when I was gone. The silence that followed was quick and sharp. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Are you sure you can manage your expenses?" he asked, his tone measured. "Will you need to sell anything to stay afloat?" His eyes flicked toward the window where the evening light caught the tops of the pines, the direction of the Vermont cabin. Rebecca stayed quiet, her lips pressed together. She reached for her glass, took a slow sip, and looked down at her plate as if reading something there. Her fingers tapped once against the stem of the glass, a small, restless movement. Lucas reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "As long as you're all right, Mom, that's what matters." His voice was soft, steady, without a trace of calculation. I felt the warmth of his hand solid and sure, and it anchored me in that moment. The conversation moved on, but it was thinner now, like a sheet stretched too far. Daniel asked about the car, the upkeep on the lake property. Rebecca mentioned hearing about a neighbor who had to downsize. Lucas helped clear the dishes, stacking them carefully by the sink, while I wrapped the bread in a cloth for later. As the night wound down, Daniel checked his watch and said he had an early meeting. Rebecca gathered her things, her phone lighting up with another call, before she was even at the door. Lucas lingered, drying the last of the plates, asking if I needed anything from town in the coming week. When the door closed behind the last of them, I stood alone in the quiet dining room. The chairs still held the shape of their bodies, the air faint with the scent of wine and roasted chicken. Outside, the cold had settled in, and through the glass I could see the outline of the cabin road fading into the dark. I gathered the last of the plates from the table, the silverware clinking softly against the porcelain, as I carried them into the kitchen. Lucas was already at the sink running warm water, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He gave me a small smile and said he would finish up so I could sit down. I stayed for a moment, folding the linen napkins, watching the steam rise from the basin as he worked. His presence felt like the last trace of warmth in a house that had gone suddenly cold. Daniel had left not long after his watch check, saying there was a meeting he needed to prepare for. He had avoided my eyes as he slipped on his coat, his briefcase already in hand. Rebecca had followed close behind, her phone pressed to her ear before she even reached the doorway. She had hugged me quickly, the kind of embrace that felt more like a formality than a comfort. Their absence was sharper than the quiet that followed. When Lucas finished drying the last dish, he set it in the cabinet and asked if I wanted him to take the trash out to the bin. I told him I could manage and thanked him for staying. He pulled on his jacket, gave me another hug, and promised to stop by during the week. I stood at the door until the sound of his truck faded down the road. The house felt larger without voices in it, the tick of the hallway clock suddenly loud in the stillness. I walked back to the dining room and let my eyes rest on the table. The chairs were slightly askew glasses, half drained of water crumbs scattered on the cloth. It looked like the remnants of a celebration that had never quite taken hold. I began to clear it slowly, folding the cloth and brushing the crumbs into my hand. In the study, the lamp on the desk cast a warm circle of light over my leather-bound journal. I pulled it closer, smoothing the page with my palm before uncapping my pen. The ink flowed easily as I wrote the date at the top, then began to note what I had seen. Daniel's questions about selling property, the way his eyes moved toward the window when the cabin came up. Rebecca's silence, her gaze fixed on her plate, her hands restless against the stem of her glass. No direct anger, no outburst, just a quiet recalculation in their faces, as if they were adding up numbers in their heads. I paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page, thinking of how quickly the warmth of the meal had drained from the room once the news was out. Even their voices had changed, becoming careful, measured. Only Lucas had reached across the table, only he had spoken without thinking of what might be lost. I wrote it all down, each detail as plainly as I could. This was only the beginning, I reminded myself. People often showed their truest selves not in the moment of shock, but in the days and weeks after when they thought no one was watching. The plan had been set in motion, and now my part was to pay attention. Closing the journal. I felt the weight of it in my hands, the way it seemed heavier than paper and leather should be. I placed it in the top drawer of the desk and slid it shut. The click of the latch sounded final, like a promise I had made to myself. I turned off the lamp and let the study fall into shadow. In the hallway, the clock chimed once, marking the hour. The air felt cooler now, the kind of chill that seeps in when the fire burns low. Upstairs, the bed was neatly made, the room untouched since morning. I changed into my nightclothes, the fabric soft against my skin, and pulled the quilt over me. The silence pressed in around me, not hostile, but not welcoming either. Lying there, I pictured their faces again, the slight shifts in expression, the pauses before they spoke. Those moments would matter later, I was certain. For now, I had all the time I needed to keep watching. The days began to settle into a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. I woke to the sound of the wind moving through the pines behind the house, made my coffee, and checked the phone for messages. Most mornings there was nothing from Daniel. 2 weeks passed before an email appeared from him, short and businesslike, asking if I had considered selling the cabin in Vermont or the lake property in New Hampshire. He suggested that liquidating those assets might be the best way to make things easier for me. There was no mention of how I was feeling or whether I needed help. Rebecca called once in that first month. Her voice was light at the start, a little too bright, before she asked if I still had the jewelry box her father had given me years ago. She said she had been thinking of having some pieces appraised, maybe using them for a fundraiser at work. I told her I still had them and left it at that. After we hung up, I stood at the window with the phone in my hand, watching a light snow drift down, wondering if she had even realized we had spoken for less than 4 minutes. Lucas, on the other hand, appeared at my door every Saturday morning. He would bring a sack of groceries often with something he knew I liked, fresh apples or a loaf from the bakery. One week he fixed the section of fence that had been leaning all summer. Another time he cleaned the gutters without being asked. We would share lunch at the kitchen table, his stories about his students mixing with my updates on the garden. He never mentioned money, never asked about the properties or the accounts. When he left, the house felt a little less empty. It was during the 2nd month that the first crack in the quiet appeared. I did not see it myself, but Olivia told me later in her own careful way. She had been upstairs in her room, she said, when she heard her mother's voice downstairs. Rebecca was in the living room with Daniel. They had met for coffee and brought it back to her house. Olivia was not trying to listen, but certain words carried easily through the floor. She heard Daniel mention the will and the need to be practical. Rebecca's reply was sharper. She said if things stayed the way they were, Lucas would end up with more than he deserved. There was a pause, and then Daniel's voice again, lower this time, suggesting ways to make sure the larger share came to them. Olivia told me she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands, trying to make sense of it. She was only 15, but she understood enough to feel unsettled. When she came down later, they were in the kitchen talking about something else, the tone easy and casual. She did not say anything to them, just grabbed her bag and went to a friend's house. She said she kept thinking about how different they sounded from the people she thought she knew. When she told me this, weeks later, it was over tea at my kitchen table. Her voice was quiet, and she looked toward the window as if unsure whether she should be telling me at all. I listened without interrupting, my hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. I could see the conflict in her loyalty to her mother, pulling against the unease she felt. I thanked her for telling me and told her she had done nothing wrong by hearing it. After she left that day, I walked into the study and opened my journal. The pen moved slowly at first, but then the words came steady. I wrote about the absence of calls from Daniel, the single short conversation with Rebecca, the steady presence of Lucas. I added what Olivia had told me, every detail I could remember. It was one thing to suspect, another to have it confirmed in the voice of someone who had heard it firsthand. When I closed the journal, the sun had dropped behind the trees, leaving the room in a cool blue light. I sat for a moment longer, listening to the old clock in the hallway, the sound measured and certain. The house was quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt like something was gathering, slow and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The next morning, I decided to walk into town for coffee instead of making it at home. The air was brisk, the kind that stung your cheeks but woke you up in the best way. I tucked my scarf in tighter and followed the familiar sidewalk past the library and the post office until the bell above the door of Miller's Cafe chimed as I stepped inside. The warmth hit me instantly, along with the smell of fresh pastries and brewed coffee. Eddie Miller was sitting at his usual corner table, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him. He looked up and grinned, his weathered face breaking into deep lines that made him seem both tired and kind. We had known each other for decades, first as neighbors, then as friends, who checked in on each other when the snowstorms came through. I ordered a black coffee and slid into the seat across from him. We talked about the weather, the early frost, and how the maple trees had turned later this year. Then Eddie leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly as if he was deciding whether to share something heavier. He told me about a man he used to work with, a good man by most accounts, who had passed away a few years back. His children had been close before his death, but the moment the will was read, they began to fight. Arguments turned into court filings. Holidays passed without calls. By the end of it, the estate was divided, but the family was beyond repair. He said it was the money that lit the fire, but it was pride and resentment that kept it burning. He took a slow sip of his coffee before telling me I reminded him of that man in one way. I had built something worth protecting, but what would happen to it when I was gone depended on more than paperwork. He told me not to underestimate how people could change when they thought something was slipping away from them. I listened, turning his words over in my mind. I thought about Daniel's careful questions, Rebecca's silence, the conversation Olivia had overheard. I told Eddie I had been thinking about making some changes, but I was not sure how to start. He leaned in a little, his voice steady, and said if he were me, he would talk to a lawyer who specialized in estates. Not just to decide where the money would go, but to make sure there was no room for fights later. He added quietly that sometimes it was not about avoiding conflict, but about deciding which conflicts were worth having. I stared at the steam curling up from my cup. The idea had been in my mind for weeks, but hearing it from someone else made it feel like a step I could not ignore. Eddie reached for his newspaper again, but before he opened it, he looked at me and said I should also be ready for something else. If I went through with this and my children did not agree with what I set in place, I had to be prepared for the possibility that they would turn against me. His eyes were kind when he said it, but the warning in his voice stayed with me. We finished our coffee in a quieter rhythm after that. Eddie told me about a repair he needed to make on his porch, and how the snowblower might need a tune-up before the first heavy snow. When we stood to leave, he pulled his coat on slowly and patted my arm the way someone does when they want to say more but know the time for it has passed. Outside, the cold felt sharper. I walked home with my hands deep in my pockets, thinking about his story and the look in his eyes when he warned me. By the time I reached my driveway, the decision was made. I went inside, set my keys on the counter, and picked up the phone. My fingers hesitated only once before dialing the number of Thomas Reed, an estate lawyer I had met briefly at a charity dinner years ago. I left a message asking for a meeting, my voice calm but certain, and then stood there for a moment listening to the quiet of the house settle around me again. Thomas called back the next afternoon while I was in the kitchen peeling apples for a pie. His voice was warm but direct, and within minutes we had agreed he would come to the house later that week. When Thursday arrived, the sky hung low with thick gray clouds and the air carried the scent of snow. I put on a fresh pot of coffee and straightened the living room before his car pulled into the driveway. He stepped inside carrying a slim leather briefcase, his coat draped over one arm. Thomas was in his early 60s, tall with a calm presence that made it easy to believe he had guided more than a few families through difficult decisions. We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had told my children the money was gone, and I began to tell him everything. I did not spare the details from Daniel's pointed questions about selling property, to Rebecca's call about the jewelry, to what Olivia had overheard. He listened without interrupting, jotting a few notes as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said he understood what I wanted: a plan that ensured the money was used in a way that honored my values, even if that meant upsetting the balance my children thought they could count on. Then he outlined what he believed was the best option for my situation. It was something called an incentive trust. Daniel would only receive his share if he met specific charitable goals such as documented volunteer hours or contributions to community projects. Rebecca's portion would be directed into an education fund for underprivileged girls, with part of it providing her a modest monthly stipend. Lucas, given his consistent care and lack of expectation, would receive his share outright, no conditions attached. I listened carefully, picturing each of their faces as he spoke. The fairness was in the intent, not in the numbers being equal. Still, the image of Daniel's expression when he learned about these conditions was sharp in my mind. I asked Thomas how enforceable something like this would be. He assured me the legal framework was solid, but then his voice took on a weight that made me put down my coffee. He said I needed to understand the risks. If Daniel felt his share was being withheld unfairly, especially if he suspected favoritism, he could challenge the trust in court. Even if the challenge had little chance of succeeding, it could drag on for months, maybe years, and cost more than money. It could pull the family further apart than it already was. He told me stories of clients whose children had stopped speaking to them over similar disputes, some never reconciling. I felt the truth of his words settle in my chest. The idea of my children in a courtroom facing each other across polished wooden tables made my stomach twist. Yet the thought of doing nothing, of letting the fortune become a weapon in their hands, felt worse. I told him I agreed with the structure, but I wanted time before signing anything. He nodded, sliding the folder across the table toward me, the pages inside neatly tabbed and marked. We went over the details together, each condition written in plain language, the disbursements and oversight outlined clearly. I asked questions about who would manage the trust after I was gone, how the benchmarks would be tracked, what would happen if a condition wasn't met. His answers were measured and thorough, each one tightening the plan into something real. When he left, the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, catching in the cuffs of his coat, as he walked to his car. I stood at the window until the taillights disappeared down the road, the folder still on the table beside me. The house was quiet, except for the faint hiss of the radiator. I placed my hand on the folder, feeling the cool smoothness of the cover, and knew I was holding both a shield and a spark. I was not ready to light it just yet. A week later, I drove to Portsmouth for a winter fundraiser hosted at the old Whitmore Hotel. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and mulled wine, and the sound of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom. I had been invited years in a row, but this was the first time in months I felt up to going. People mingled in small clusters, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, and I moved through the crowd with a glass of water in my hand, stopping to greet a few familiar faces. Near the back of the room, I spotted Michael Torres, his broad frame and easy smile unchanged since I had last seen him. He had been one of Daniel's earliest business contacts when my son was breaking into commercial real estate. We had met at several company gatherings over the years, and I remembered him as the kind of man who noticed everything, but spoke only when it mattered. He greeted me warmly and asked how I had been. I gave the polite answer, then asked about him, and before long we were standing off to the side where the noise of the crowd was softer. He said he had actually been in touch with Daniel recently. Daniel was pushing hard to land a major redevelopment contract in Boston, something with a price tag high enough to cement his reputation in the industry. Michael's tone shifted slightly when he added that there had been complications. I waited, sensing he was deciding whether to go on. Finally, he told me that word had gotten around about tensions in our family. Someone he didn't say who had mentioned that Daniel was positioning himself to control the bulk of my estate when the time came. In Daniel's world, rumors traveled fast, and this one had reached the ears of a key partner on the Boston project. The partner had quietly pulled out, leaving Daniel's proposal suddenly short of the financing it needed. Michael's brows drew together as he said it was a shame, but in business perception was as dangerous as truth. I felt the air change around me, the music and conversation in the ballroom fading for a moment. It was not satisfaction I felt, not exactly. It was the recognition that Daniel's own ambition had curved back toward him, cutting away at the image he had worked so hard to polish. The idea that I needed to expose him to protect my plans seemed almost unnecessary. He was already eroding the foundation of his own making. Michael shook his head and said he hoped Daniel would recover, maybe take this as a lesson to tread more carefully. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, but inside I was weighing what this meant for the choices ahead of me. Daniel was capable, clever, and determined, but he also believed he could outmaneuver anyone, including me. Now he had proof that the wrong whispers could cost him more than money. We talked a little longer about safer topics, the weather, the renovations Michael was making to his lake house. Eventually, someone called him over to meet a client, and I watched him go, his words still looping in my mind. I made my way toward the coat check, the weight of the evening settling over me in a way I hadn't expected. Outside, the wind had picked up, sweeping across the square and rattling the bare branches along the street. I pulled my scarf tighter and walked to my car, the snow underfoot crunching with each step. As I started the engine and let the heat build, I sat for a moment looking at the glow of the hotel windows in the distance. Somewhere inside, the music was still playing, glasses were still clinking, and deals were being made. But one deal at least had slipped through Daniel's fingers, and that was something he had done all on his own. The following weekend, I called each of my children and invited them for lunch. I kept my voice light, mentioning I had found something interesting and wanted their opinion. The morning of the meal, I set the dining room with simple place settings, nothing as formal as our last gathering, but enough to make the room feel warm. A pot of beef stew simmered on the stove, the scent of thyme and onions filling the air, and a loaf of crusty bread cooled on the counter. Daniel arrived first, as he often did, stepping inside with his phone still in his hand, thumb moving across the screen. He set it down only long enough to shrug off his coat and greet me with a quick hug. Rebecca came a few minutes later, cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying a container of cookies from a bakery in town. She kissed my cheek and glanced at Daniel as she slipped off her gloves. Lucas showed up right on time, holding a bunch of fresh flowers he placed in a vase on the table without being asked. We settled in, bowls filled bread passed around, the sound of spoons against porcelain filling the spaces between small talk. When the plates were nearly half empty, I folded my hands on the table and told them I had come across a few $100,000 in an old account I had forgotten about. It was not a fortune, I said, but enough to be worth dividing. I wanted to hear what each of them thought would be fair. The room went quiet for a moment. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He said he had the largest financial load with the mortgage, private school tuition for his kids, and business expenses. He thought it made sense for him to take the larger portion, not all of it, but more than the others. His tone was measured, but there was a hint of expectation underneath. Rebecca cleared her throat, keeping her gaze on her bowl as she spoke. She thought an even split was the only fair way to handle it. Dividing based on need would cause tension, she said, and it was better to keep things simple. She glanced up once, not at me, but toward Daniel, her eyes flicking just long enough to read like an exchange without words. Lucas sat back, his spoon resting in the bowl. He said honestly he thought I should keep it or give it to someone who truly needed it. He wasn't saying it to sound generous, he added, but he didn't want money to be the last thing we talked about at the table. I felt a quiet gratitude settle in my chest at his words. As we moved back into conversation, I noticed the small signs. Rebecca reaching for her water, her eyes sliding toward Daniel again when she thought I wasn't looking. Daniel nodding subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if agreeing to something unsaid. It was not overt, but the undercurrent was there, a shared understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with me. We finished the meal with coffee and slices of the bread, the crust cracking under the knife. Daniel mentioned a business trip coming up. Rebecca talked about a new project at work, and Lucas told me about a student who had just gotten into college. It was pleasant on the surface, but the weight of what I had seen pressed in around the edges. They left soon after Daniel with his phone already back in hand, Rebecca promising to send me a recipe she thought I'd like. Lucas lingered a few minutes longer, carrying the dishes to the kitchen and rinsing them before he pulled on his jacket. When the door closed behind him, the house settled into its familiar quiet. I walked back to the dining room and looked at the table, the chairs pushed back at slightly different angles, the vase of flowers still fresh and bright against the winter light. I knew then that whatever path I chose next, I would have to account not just for their words, but for the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. I called Thomas Reed first, asking if he could come to the house on Saturday afternoon. My voice was steady, almost too calm for what I knew would be a pivotal moment. He agreed without hesitation, his tone professional but warm, and I hung up with the date set. Then I sent 3 short messages to my children, each one a simple invitation to meet, no details, just the time and place. By Friday evening, all 3 had confirmed. The morning of the meeting was bright but cold, the kind of winter light that makes every surface sharper. I spent hours making the house ready, not because I needed it perfect, but because I wanted nothing to distract from what was about to happen. The dining table was polished to a soft shine, a pot of coffee set on the sideboard, cups and saucers lined neatly. In the center of the table sat 3 thick envelopes, each one with their name written in my hand. When the knock came, it was Thomas. He stepped inside, removing his gloves, the folder tucked under his arm. We spoke quietly in the kitchen, going over the plan once more. He nodded when I told him I was certain, though I caught the faint crease in his brow that told me he understood the risks. Daniel arrived next wearing his usual tailored coat, his expression alert, maybe even suspicious. Rebecca followed closely behind, dressed smartly, her hair pulled back so tightly it gave her an almost severe look. Lucas came last, a little windblown with that unhurried smile he seemed to carry everywhere. They greeted me in turn, the small talk quick and thin before I gestured for them to sit. I remained standing for a moment, letting the silence draw their eyes to me. Then I told them the truth. I had not lost the inheritance. Every cent was still here. I had told them it was gone to see something I could not otherwise see. I paused long enough for the words to sink in. Daniel's face flushed almost immediately, a deep red creeping up his neck. Rebecca froze, her shoulders tightening. Her hands clasped together on her lap. Lucas simply leaned back slightly, his mouth curving into a small, quiet smile. I placed a hand on each envelope and slid them forward one at a time until each sat in front of them. They looked down but didn't move to open them until I nodded. The sound of paper tearing filled the air. Inside were the trust documents, each account holding a number that made their eyes widen, just over $34 million apiece. Daniel's jaw worked as if he were grinding down unspoken words. Rebecca stared hard at the page, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lucas glanced at the paper briefly, then set it down and looked back at me. Before they could speak, I told them there was more. The division would not be simple. Daniel's share would be placed in a philanthropic trust released in increments based on his volunteer work and community contributions. Rebecca's would fund scholarships for underprivileged girls with a monthly stipend for her own needs. Lucas's share would be his to manage freely. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Daniel's head snapped up, his mouth parting in disbelief. Rebecca blinked rapidly as though trying to process and calculate at the same time. Lucas didn't move, only kept his eyes on me, steady and calm. Thomas sat quietly at the far end, his presence a silent boundary, making it clear the conversation was official. I could feel the weight in the air, a mixture of shock, anger, and something else that none of them were ready to name yet. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker, and I knew the next words spoken would be the ones to shape everything that followed. Daniel was the first to break the silence, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "So this is how it is," he said, leaning forward. "You think you can dangle this in front of us like we're children and then control every move we make?" His eyes were hard, fixed on me as if I had orchestrated some personal betrayal. Rebecca didn't look at me or at him. She stayed very still. Her eyes lowered to the papers in front of her. I saw the first tear slide down her cheek, catching in the corner of her mouth before she brushed it away quickly, as if hoping no one had noticed. Thomas spoke, then his voice calm but firm, explaining that the terms were entirely legal and designed to ensure the funds were used in ways that aligned with my intentions. The structure, he said, was not about punishment but about purpose. Olivia had been sitting quietly beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap. She leaned toward me when no one else was watching and whispered so softly I almost missed it. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm embarrassed by all of this." My chest tightened at the weight of her words, not because they were unexpected, but because they came from the youngest person in the room, the only one who seemed to see the ugliness for what it was. Rebecca shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the papers. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since the envelopes had been opened. There was hesitation there, a flicker of something that didn't look like anger, but something closer to doubt. Daniel pushed his chair back suddenly, the sound scraping across the floor. "I'm not signing anything today," he said. His voice clipped. "If you think I'm going to jump through hoops for money that's mine by right, you're wrong." He gathered his coat and walked out the front door, closing harder than it needed to. The room felt lighter after he left, though the tension still hummed between the rest of us. Rebecca folded her papers carefully and slid them into her bag. She stood without a word, her eyes still damp, and with Olivia at her side, she walked toward the door. I watched her pause for a moment as if she might turn back, but then she stepped out into the cold. Only Lucas remained. He got up slowly, collected the empty coffee cups, and carried them into the kitchen. I followed the sound of running water and the clink of dishes filling the quiet. He glanced over his shoulder and said simply, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I didn't realize how much until today. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I dried the plates he handed me, the familiar rhythm of the work grounding me after the chaos. The house felt steadier now, even with the storm still brewing outside, and I knew this moment with Lucas was something I'd carry with me long after the papers on the table had been signed or forgotten. Winter gave way to spring before I saw Daniel again. Word reached me through a mutual acquaintance that he had lost another major contract, this one in Hartford, after a client backed out at the last moment. The blow was public enough that it stirred talk in his circles, and by early summer he had contacted Thomas to begin the volunteer work required by the trust. I heard about it from Thomas himself, who told me Daniel had chosen a veterans' housing project in Boston. It was a start, even if his motives were tangled. I pictured him on a work site in a clean shirt and new boots, learning to use a hammer for the first time in years, and wondered if some part of the work might reach him in ways the money never could. Rebecca's change came in smaller, quieter steps. One afternoon in June, she called to tell me she had visited the first school funded by her scholarship program. She sounded almost surprised as she described the walls lined with art projects, the library stocked with new books, the cafeteria buzzing with voices. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox addressed to her, but delivered to me by mistake. Inside were handwritten letters from students thanking her for the chance to learn and dream bigger. I set them aside without opening them, then called her to let her know they had come. She laughed softly, said she already knew about the letters, and for the first time in months, her voice carried something lighter. Later, she told me she had begun writing back to the students one by one. Through it all, Lucas kept his steady rhythm. Every other Saturday, he drove up to the cabin in Vermont with me hauling supplies in the back of his truck. We worked side by side, repairing the porch rails, clearing brush along the trail, and repainting the shutters a deep forest green. The quiet there suited us both. Some afternoons we sat on the porch drinking coffee, talking about nothing important, just letting the wind in the trees fill the spaces between words. By late August, I began to see the outlines of something I hadn't expected. Daniel's temper had cooled, his calls to me no longer edged with accusation. Rebecca spoke more often, and when she did, her words carried less guardedness, more sincerity. It wasn't a transformation, not yet, but the shift was real enough to notice. Standing on the cabin porch one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, I realized the distance between us had narrowed, not through money or control, but through time and the quiet changes life had a way of insisting upon. Early September brought a crispness to the air that always made me linger on the porch a little longer. From my chair, I could see the cabin roof glinting between the trees, the paint on the shutters still fresh from the summer's work. The scent of pine drifted on the breeze, mixing with the faint smoke of a neighbor's chimney. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, letting its warmth settle into me, and thought back to the winding path that had led here. It seemed like another lifetime when I had signed the papers to sell Hayes Freight, the numbers so large they hardly felt real. I remembered the pride in that moment, and the fear too, because I knew what great sums could do to people. Over the years, I had watched families tear themselves apart over far less. I had hoped my own children would be different, that the values I had tried to plant would hold firm. The truth was, telling them the money was gone had been harder than I ever admitted out loud. It had felt like throwing a stone into still water and not knowing if the ripples would fade or grow into something that pulled us all under. But I needed to see them clearly without the veil of inheritance clouding the picture. Now, months later, I could. Daniel had been humbled in ways I could never have forced on him. The work he had been doing at the Veterans Housing Project was beginning to leave a mark, softening the sharp edges of his ambition. Rebecca, through her scholarship fund, was slowly stepping into something bigger than herself, learning that generosity could be more rewarding than accumulation. And Lucas steady? Lucas had shown me that integrity does not need a test to prove itself. The money was still there, of course, but it had shifted in my mind. It was no longer the center of our story. The real inheritance was something quieter, harder to measure, but far more enduring. It was the lessons carried in the work of their hands, the shape of their choices, the way they spoke to each other when no one was watching. I watched a squirrel dart across the yard, its tail flicking as it disappeared into the brush. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against a hollow trunk. Life went on steady and unremarkable in the best way. I thought about how one day the cabin would be theirs to share, along with whatever remained of the fortune. But whether it became a place of laughter or a battleground would depend entirely on who they had become by then. I sipped the last of my coffee, the warmth lingering even as the sun dipped lower. Money could be divided with signatures and bank transfers, but character was earned slowly in the small moments that no one wrote down. That was the true legacy I wanted to leave, the part no market crash or legal dispute could touch. And as I sat there, the breeze lifting the hem of the blanket over my knees, I felt a quiet certainty settle in me. I had done what I could to guide them. The rest was theirs to carry. If you have a story about family inheritance or the values you hope to pass on, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. Your experiences might just be the reminder someone else needs today.